Since I started on this cancer journey, I guess, in November, I've been quite a bit more of a homebody than I had been in previous months and years. Obviously, living in Colorado, there's quite a bit to do. People are very active, and so I spend a lot more time out than I have been in, say, the last 6 to 8 months, something like that. But last week I did find myself out in public more than I have been recently, and I ended up getting quite a few questions about my tattoos. It's pretty common for any heavily tattooed person to just get a bunch more questions in warm weather when you're wearing shorts and short sleeve shirts and things like that. So this is not uncommon or unexpected, but it is the time of year when that sort of thing starts to happen more. And any heavily tattooed person will tell you that they get a lot of the same questions kind of over and over again. And personally, I try to be gracious and respond positively to these questions. I know the people who are asking them are not coming from a negative place, and they don't come into these conversations having had them many, many times. But if you are a heavily tattooed person, what you find is that you just get the same questions over and over again. And I don't respond negatively to those things. I always try to answer them to the best of my ability, but they're not super interesting conversations to have, right? How many tattoos do you have? Which one hurt the most? How much have you spent? These are all pretty standard questions that I've been asked lots and lots of times. And so last week, having a couple of these conversations, I started thinking about what sorts of questions would I find more interesting with regards to my tattoos. So just off the top of my head, I came up with a small list, and here's those questions that nobody has ever asked me, but that I think would be far more interesting to answer than the standard heavily tattooed person questions. So the first one I thought of was, how far have you traveled to get a tattoo? I think that's kind of an interesting one that'll tell you a lot about how much planning has gone into any person's tattoo collection. Some people just go to their local shops and they get whatever that happens to be, and some people, plan out with their favorite artist for years and years in advance in some cases, and travel across the world to get them. And so I think that's kind of an interesting way to get to know how the person views their collection and what's important to them artistically, and what they're willing to do to get art. Another interesting question that, again, nobody has ever asked me is, what is the motivation behind my tattooing and why I did what I've done so far? Again, it's just a kind of a view of the mindset of the person getting the tattoos, and something that, they probably haven't ever been asked. And then my number one question that I wish somebody would ask me that nobody has ever asked in relation to my tattoo collection is, what's the most fun you've ever had getting tattooed? Because believe it or not, even though you're getting poked by a needle a few 100 times a second, you're still able to have a conversation. You're still able to talk to an artist. You're still able to, at least the way that I've done my tattooing, get to know somebody and have an experience in a shop. And I'll tell you, there have been times when I've been obviously suffering, but also having just an absolute blast of a time. And nobody's ever asked me really about, what was my most fun and enjoyable tattoo experience. But that's definitely a question that I could sit there and answer and talk about in depth and give someone a more interesting conversation than, how many tattoos do I have? So that's about it. I fun of these kind of off the cuff, and yeah, let me know what you think. If you're heavily tattooed, tell me what's the most interesting question you've ever gotten, and yeah, I'll talk to you later.